I'm Matt, 31, and my wife, Lena, 30, and I live in Cleveland. We've had a pretty strong marriage. About 11 years ago, when I was visiting Lena at her folks' house, her best friend Janice got in my face and grilled me on why I hadn't proposed yet. Lena stood there silently, seemingly enjoying the show, so I got the message. She wanted that ring, and I wanted to make her happy, so I started planning to marry her. 2 years later, we were hitched and have since had 2 daughters. Our wedding day was one of my happiest, and I always intended to be a good husband and father. Lena wanted a big wedding, and lots of guests turned up. We even flew some family in from the Dominican Republic. We weren't rolling in dough, but we managed well, and our daughters have always been cared for. Lena's a good mom, but she's got a mean streak. She's quick with snarky comments and often dismisses me, making it hard to talk things out. She's witty and has a fiery attitude that caught my eye initially, but her dismissiveness can be frustrating. Our daughters, ages 7 and 4, adore her, though the eldest has started to imitate some of her behavior. I work in construction management while Lena owns a nail salon. She's always had an eye for style and insists on keeping up with trends. Despite that, she's pulled back on personal spending after becoming a mom, prioritizing our daughters over her fashionista habits. Although it's a little annoying at times, I'm mostly fine with it since our girls are worth the sacrifice. We had a good thing going until I noticed some issues after we bumped into Brian, the ex-boyfriend of Lena's old friend Holly, at the supermarket. He was friendly, and at first I wasn't suspicious. But when Lena began laughing with him like old pals, her smile was a bit too wide and her laughs too frequent. It felt like I'd just stepped into a conversation that had already been going on behind the scenes. After that encounter at the supermarket, Lena and Brian started keeping in touch. She claimed it was just friendly catching up, but their conversations became more frequent and noticeably longer. They'd chat on the phone late into the night, and their exchanges on social media were suspiciously enthusiastic. Whenever I'd bring up Brian or hint at the late-night calls, Lena would dismiss my concerns, rolling her eyes and laughing it off, telling me I was just being paranoid. Things took a sharper turn on Super Bowl Sunday. That afternoon, Lena was talking to Brian on the phone when I asked her a question about the game. She answered me quickly and then walked over, saying that Brian wanted to talk to me. Caught off guard, I took the phone and said, "Hey, what's up?" He asked if I was planning to watch the Super Bowl, and when I said I was rooting for the Lions, he laughed and said he was too. He then suggested we all watch the game together at his buddy's party. Lena seemed keen on the idea, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed, not wanting to come off as insecure. We dropped the kids off at Lena's brother's place and headed over to the party. It was packed with die-hard football fans, and we arrived just in time for the halftime show. The host was rooting for the Bengals and spent the evening ranting about how they were going to win. When they lost, his disappointed reaction gave everyone a good laugh. Meanwhile, Lena and Brian were getting chummy again. They were standing close, laughing, and trading stories, with Lena's hand occasionally grazing his arm. I tried to join their conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being left out. At one point, I asked Brian why he and Holly broke up, and he shrugged, saying it wasn't serious between them. Lena laughed and chimed in, saying she was surprised because Holly had really liked him. After a while, I grabbed another beer and wandered onto the porch, chatting with a few folks out there. When I came back inside, Lena was deep in conversation with Brian in the corner. They were too close for my comfort, so I decided to observe from a distance. He was leaning in, speaking softly to her, while she giggled like a schoolgirl. My stomach twisted as I noticed the way she looked at him. I finally signaled to Lena that it was time to head home, but she seemed reluctant, wanting to stay longer. I reminded her that her brother was still waiting on us, so we said our goodbyes to Brian and left. On the drive home, I told her that Brian seemed to be flirting with her, and she just scoffed, saying I was making something out of nothing. But I knew better, and from that point on, I couldn't ignore the strange dynamic between them. It was as if Lena was enjoying his attention a bit too much. My gut told me something was brewing, but every time I brought it up, she'd get defensive and tell me to drop it. I tried to keep things normal after the Super Bowl party, but my suspicion only grew as Lena and Brian's conversations stretched into the late-night hours. The nights she would slip out to take calls or keep her phone tucked away after hanging up made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days later, Lena said she was heading over to Janice's place to do her nails. This wasn't unusual, so I didn't think much of it initially. But later that night, our youngest daughter started asking for pizza. Since I was also in the mood, I decided to call Lena and tell her not to worry about cooking. When I dialed her number, it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and the same thing happened. I waited about 30 minutes before calling Janice directly. She picked up quickly, and when I asked if Lena was still with her, she hesitated before replying. "Oh no, she left hours ago." She explained that Lena had received a phone call that seemed urgent and abruptly left after promising she'd come back the next day to do Janice's mom's nails. Janice was frustrated that Lena hadn't stuck around as she said she would, which only made my concerns more intense. I called around to a few other friends and family members, but no one had reached out to Lena that day. This left Brian as the only person who could have drawn her away. I was fuming and knew I needed to act fast. After putting the kids to bed, I called up my buddy Dave, who lived nearby. I explained the situation and asked if he could come over to watch the kids for a couple of hours while I sorted things out. Dave could hear the frustration in my voice and agreed to help. He showed up within 15 minutes, and I grabbed my car keys, intent on finding Lena. Brian had mentioned the general area he lived in during the Super Bowl party, so I headed in that direction, hoping I'd be able to spot Lena's silver sedan parked nearby. I cruised slowly through the neighborhood, scanning both sides of the street. It was a sketchy area, but at that point, I didn't care. Finally, I spotted her car parked in front of a dingy apartment complex. My heart sank as I pulled over to the side and watched for any sign of Lena. A few minutes later, she emerged, wearing a pink tracksuit and looking disheveled. Brian trailed behind her, casually dressed in a tank top and shorts. He was grinning ear to ear, standing much too close to Lena, who didn't seem to mind one bit. As I watched them chat and laugh before she got into her car, my blood boiled. They were entirely too comfortable with each other, and my worst fears felt like they were being confirmed. I knew there was no way her phone had died conveniently during her little visit. All I could do was hope I'd beat her back home. I managed to get home before Lena, my mind racing with fury. Dave was in the living room, keeping an eye on the kids as they played. I thanked him and quickly sent him on his way, promising to fill him in later. My stomach churned as I tried to decide what I'd say when Lena finally walked through the door. Almost 40 minutes later, she finally arrived, walking in without saying a word. Her expression was guarded as she strolled straight past me and headed to the bedroom. I followed her in and immediately asked, "Why was your phone turned off?" She glanced back at me with a tired sigh. "My phone died, and I had to charge it," she muttered. "What's the big deal?" "Where have you been?" I pressed. "I told you I was at Janice's," she replied with an edge to her voice. "That's not what Janice said. She told me you left hours ago, so where were you?" Lena paused for a moment, her irritation palpable. "I swung by to see Brian for a little while. He wanted to catch up." "Catch up?" I scoffed. "You were at his apartment for nearly 2 hours. Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Because you always overreact. Every time I mention his name, you start acting like a jealous teenager. Do you really expect me to believe you weren't doing anything wrong?" "God, Matt," she groaned. "You're being ridiculous. There's nothing going on between us. He's just a friend." "Then why does he keep calling you late at night? And why do you have to go over to his place when you're supposed to be at Janice's?" Lena let out an exasperated sigh and looked away. "I don't have time for this," she snapped. "I'm exhausted, and I don't want to argue." She brushed past me and headed to the living room, where she slumped onto the couch and started scrolling through her phone. I watched her for a moment, disbelief tightening in my chest. This wasn't the Lena I had known all these years. That night, she was distant and cold, barely acknowledging the kids before retreating to bed. I was left standing in the living room, angry and confused, wondering where things had gone so wrong. All the signs were pointing in one direction, and despite Lena's denial, my gut was screaming that she was lying to my face. After that night, I couldn't let my suspicions go. I began keeping a closer eye on Lena's interactions with Brian. She still spent late hours on her phone, and her social media was flooded with comments and likes on Brian's posts. Her phone was always with her, like it had become another limb. A few days later, while I was at work, She called me up and casually mentioned that she'd be visiting Janice's house again. Janice's mom needs her nails done, she said, almost too smoothly. But this time, I was determined to uncover the truth. That evening, I drove by Janice's place after work and waited in my car a couple of streets down. An hour passed, and Lena's car was nowhere to be seen. Feeling a knot tighten in my stomach, I drove toward Brian's neighborhood instead. It didn't take long to find Lena's silver sedan parked once again outside that same rundown apartment complex. I sat there in the car, gripping the steering wheel and seething at the betrayal playing out before me. I wanted to barge in and confront her right there, but I knew that it would end badly for everyone involved, especially our kids. So I held back and drove home. The following morning, as she got ready for work, I decided to confront her once more. "Did you actually go to Janice's last night?" I asked, crossing my arms. Lena's eyes darted around before she let out an exasperated sigh. "Yes, of course I did. Why do you keep asking me this?" I stared at her, trying to contain my anger. "Then why was your car parked outside Brian's apartment again?" Her face paled, but she quickly recovered, scoffing at me with a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Are you stalking me now, Matt?" "I'm trying to find out what my wife is doing behind my back," I shot back. "So what's going on between you and Brian? And don't lie to me." She put her hands on her hips and glared. "I told you he's just a friend. You're being ridiculous." "Just a friend? Then why lie about where you're going? Why not just tell me you're meeting up with him?" Lena didn't respond. Instead, she pushed past me, muttering, "I can't deal with this right now," and left for work. That was the final straw. I couldn't continue living in this constant state of paranoia and suspicion, and it was clear she wasn't going to tell me the truth willingly. I decided to reach out to a few close friends and family members to get advice and support on what to do next. My best friend Dave told me to lay low for a while and start gathering evidence. "You need to be prepared," he said. "If this does go south, you have to protect yourself and the kids." That advice stuck with me, and I knew it was time to start documenting everything. I followed Dave's advice and began carefully observing Lena's behavior. Every time she said she was heading out to meet friends or run errands, I took note of the time, location, and duration. I'd make mental notes of her demeanor, especially after she'd been on the phone with Brian. One evening, I noticed that Lena had her phone plugged into the charger in the living room while she was taking a shower. The opportunity was too good to pass up. With my heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed her phone and quickly scanned her recent messages. Sure enough, Brian's name was right at the top. Their conversation was full of flirty banter, and she had saved a couple of his shirtless selfies. They'd been talking almost daily, and the messages clearly indicated that their relationship wasn't just friendly. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the texts. The latest exchange had them planning to meet up the following night. I put the phone back in place just as I heard the water shut off. I knew I had enough evidence now, but I needed to see it in person to confirm my suspicions. I resolved to follow Lena the next night. The following evening, I made up an excuse to stay late at work and told her to go ahead with her plans. She seemed pleased and assured me she was just going to catch up with Janice. As soon as Lena left, I got in my car and drove toward Brian's apartment complex, parking at a discreet distance where I could see the entrance without being noticed. I didn't have to wait long before her silver sedan pulled up, and she walked inside, not looking back. After about an hour, the front door swung open, and Brian stepped out to smoke a cigarette. He was wearing a tank top and shorts again, looking relaxed and casual. He made a phone call and paced around the front porch, clearly waiting for something or someone. A few minutes later, Lena appeared behind him, laughing and wrapping her arms around his waist as she whispered something in his ear. He turned around, grinning, and planted a kiss on her forehead. They stood there for a moment before heading back inside, arm in arm. That was all I needed to see. My suspicion had transformed into a sickening certainty, and I could hardly keep my composure as I drove back home. The next morning, when Lena finally returned, she wore a smug expression, like she'd gotten away with something. She didn't even acknowledge me, just went straight to the bathroom to get ready for work. I knew I had to confront her, but this time I'd have to handle it carefully. I called Dave and told him what I'd seen. He encouraged me to stay calm and focus on the next steps. "You've got your proof now," he said firmly. "It's time to protect yourself and the kids. Talk to a lawyer and document everything." After speaking with Dave, I made the call to a divorce attorney and scheduled an appointment for the next day. I couldn't go into this blindly. I needed to know what my rights were and how best to protect my daughters. That evening, I told Lena I had a long day at work and would turn in early. I needed the extra time to collect my thoughts and prepare for what I would ask the lawyer. The attorney was direct and matter-of-fact, giving me a sobering rundown of the process. He advised me to gather as much evidence as possible before filing and to consider moving some finances to a separate account. It all felt overwhelming, but I knew I had to keep a clear head. After returning home, I found Lena lounging on the couch, phone in hand and completely absorbed. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I went to the kitchen, trying to figure out how best to proceed. I couldn't let this drag on, but I needed to confirm one last thing before taking action. That weekend, Lena said she was heading to Janice's again, and my suspicions flared up. This time, I followed her once more, but kept my distance. She drove to Brian's neighborhood, and after a brief stop at a convenience store for snacks, she went right back to his apartment. Her silver sedan parked in the exact same spot it had the other night. She didn't emerge for nearly 3 hours. By the time she returned home, it was almost 11 p.m., and she sauntered in like nothing was wrong. I could barely contain my anger as she cheerfully asked if the kids had eaten dinner. "Yeah," I replied coldly, "they have." She caught the edge in my voice and tilted her head. "Is something wrong?" "Yeah, Lena, something is very wrong," I said, crossing my arms. "Where were you tonight?" Her face hardened, and she sighed dramatically. "I told you, I was at Janice's." "No, you weren't," I shot back. "You were at Brian's apartment, and I know you've been there several times before." The room fell silent. She stood there, stunned, searching for words. "How did you know?" she finally stammered. "I've been following you," I admitted, my voice firm. "I've seen you together. How long has this been going on?" Lena remained tight-lipped, but her eyes said it all. I knew she wasn't going to come clean without a fight. "You can't just sneak around behind my back and lie to me like this," I continued. "I know you're not just friends with Brian." She took a deep breath, her lips pursed, and said, "Fine, Matt. If you really want to know, then yes, I've been seeing him. But you know what? It's because I'm tired of you acting like my jailer." "What are you talking about?" I asked incredulously. "You never give me any space," she snapped. "You're always checking in on me, always suspicious of everything I do. I needed a break and Brian was there." "That's your excuse," I retorted. "You think that justifies what you've done?" Lena didn't respond. Instead, she simply turned around and walked away, leaving me standing there, seething. I knew what needed to happen next, and my resolve strengthened as I headed to the bedroom and started making a list of things to do. The first step was making sure that my kids would be okay through all of this. I would not let her betrayal ruin their lives. After that heated confrontation, I couldn't stand being in the same room as Lena. I stayed up most of the night on the couch, stewing over our argument and dreading the inevitable fallout. My daughters were blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing, which only made my resolve stronger to protect them from it as much as possible. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at their grandmother's house so they could spend the day there while I planned my next steps. I called Dave and explained what had happened the previous night. He wasn't surprised by Lena's reaction, but assured me I was doing the right thing. "You've got to look out for yourself and the girls now," he reminded me. "Start getting your paperwork together and make sure you've got everything lined up for the lawyer." I spent the rest of the day preparing. I gathered bank statements, our marriage certificate, and any relevant paperwork that could help my case. I also made sure I had screenshots of Lena's messages with Brian and the photos I'd taken of them together outside his apartment. It felt like a gut punch going through it all, but I knew I had to be thorough. Later that evening, Lena came home, noticeably tense and avoiding eye contact. She didn't say much as she settled on the couch, glancing up at me now and then. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" I asked quietly. She hesitated before sighing and rubbing her temples. "I don't know, Matt. Everything's just so messed up right now." "Are you still seeing Brian?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from her. She looked down and shook her head slowly. "Yes." "Then I think we both know what needs to happen next." Lena frowned, but her gaze stayed on the floor. "What do you mean?" "We need to separate. I'm not going to keep living like this, and the girls don't deserve this instability." Her eyes welled up with tears as she wiped at them. but she didn't try to deny it. "I'm sorry, Matt," she whispered. "I didn't mean for things to get this far." "It's too late for apologies," I said firmly. "We'll figure out a way to co-parent the kids, but I'm filing for divorce." Lena looked devastated, but didn't argue. She simply nodded and murmured, "Okay." That night she slept in the guest room, and I stayed up late drafting a detailed email to my lawyer, outlining what had happened and asking for advice on how best to proceed. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at school and headed straight to the attorney's office to finalize my intentions. There was no going back now. I had made up my mind to leave this behind and start fresh for my own sake and for my daughters. With a heavy heart, I met with the attorney again to discuss the next steps. He reviewed the documents I'd brought and the evidence I had collected against Lena. He emphasized how important it was to remain calm and handle things professionally, especially for the sake of our daughters. "We'll need to figure out a custody arrangement that works best for the children," he said thoughtfully, "and ensure their transition is as smooth as possible." That evening, when I returned home, Lena had already packed a bag and was waiting in the living room. She sat on the couch, staring into space, looking like she hadn't slept at all. "Matt," she said softly, "I'll be staying at Janice's for a while. I think it's best if I'm not here right now." "I agree," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need some space." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our shattered marriage looming between us. Finally, she asked, "What about the girls? They'll want to know why I'm not here." "I'll explain to them that you're taking some time away," I said firmly, "but you should be the one to tell them yourself." She nodded, and after a deep breath, she called the girls into the living room. They were confused at first, but as Lena explained that she needed to leave for a while, their little faces crumpled. She promised to see them soon and hugged them tightly. I stood back and let her have that moment, knowing it would be hard for them to understand what was going on. After saying her goodbyes, Lena gave me one last look before walking out the door and into the night. The girls clung to me, sobbing softly, and I did my best to comfort them, even as my own emotions threatened to overwhelm me. The next few days were tough. The house felt emptier without Lena around, and the girls kept asking when she'd be back. I tried to keep their routine as normal as possible, but the strain showed, especially in my oldest daughter, who had started withdrawing into herself. Lena would call occasionally, asking to speak with the kids, and I'd hand the phone over while keeping the conversation brief. She didn't come by often, but when she did, she and the girls would spend time together at the park or at her friend's place. Meanwhile, I worked with the attorney to finalize the divorce papers and arrange a custody plan. It was draining emotionally and financially, but I couldn't let the turmoil stop me. I had to be strong for my daughters. One afternoon, about a week later, Lena dropped by to pick up some more of her things. She looked worn down, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. "Matt," she said softly, "can we talk?" "What is there left to talk about?" I replied, my voice tired. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, tears brimming in her eyes, "for everything." I crossed my arms, my face expressionless. "Apologies don't change what happened, Lena." "I know," she whispered, "but I want to make things right with the girls. They deserve better." "We both do," I said firmly. "Let's keep things civil for their sake, and maybe one day we can talk about forgiveness." She nodded and gathered the last of her things before leaving quietly. I watched as she drove away, feeling the finality of it all settle deep in my bones. Over the following weeks, Lena and I settled into a routine, each navigating our separate lives while maintaining a civil front for our daughters. The divorce process moved along steadily, and the custody arrangement took shape. We agreed on a schedule that would give Lena every other weekend and one evening per week with the girls. It wasn't perfect, but it ensured stability for them, which was all I cared about. During this time, I started to rebuild my life. I found solace in spending quality time with the kids and leaned heavily on my close friends and family. Dave became my sounding board, helping me see the light on days when the darkness seemed overwhelming. One Saturday morning, I sat down with my daughters for breakfast and gently asked them how they were feeling about everything. My oldest, Emma, looked down at her cereal and finally spoke up. "Dad, I miss Mom, but VDJ plus, it's different now." I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes. My heart broke, but I knew I had to be honest with her. "I know, sweetheart, things are different. but I want you to know that no matter what, your mom and I both love you and your sister very much." "Why did she leave?" my youngest Lucy asked innocently. I took a deep breath. "Your mom had some things she needed to figure out, and we decided it was best to live in separate places." "But will she come back?" "She'll still see you both often," I assured them, "and she'll always be your mom." After breakfast, we went out for a day at the park, and the girls seemed to relax as they played. Seeing them smile gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I knew the road ahead would be tough, but we would navigate it together. Meanwhile, Lena's calls became less frequent. She saw the girls as planned, but was noticeably distant, which the kids picked up on. It was clear that her new life with Brian was keeping her occupied, and I realized that our lives were slowly diverging. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and as I signed the last of the paperwork, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't just the end of my marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter. In the months that followed, I focused on my daughters, my work, and my own personal growth. I started attending a support group for single parents and connected with others who had gone through similar situations. Their encouragement helped me see that I wasn't alone and that brighter days were ahead. As for Lena, she and Brian eventually broke up, and she tried to reach out to me to apologize again. But by then, I had moved on emotionally. I kept our conversations strictly about the kids and ensured we maintained a civil relationship for their sake. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy, but I'm grateful for the people who helped me through it. My daughters are doing well, and they've grown stronger because of everything we went through. I've learned that sometimes you have to let go of the past to embrace the future fully. Life might not have turned out the way I expected, but we're doing just fine.